Year 10 and welcome to yet another video from me about Nazi social policies. So with this one we are going to go on to look at the persecution of minority groups under the Nazi regime. It's quite a serious topic. Now, when we think about persecution under the Nazi regime, we think about the Jews predominantly, because 6 million Jews lost their lives as part of a Holocaust that took place in World War II. However, it was a whole group of different people from different races as well, including people that were German, so were part of the kind of master race, as Hitler calls them, but for one reason or another, Hitler believed were not desirable as part of his regime. So I'm going to talk through that to begin with. So I will begin by talking about why Hitler decided to persecute minority groups. And the main reason why he chose to do that was because he had an ideology, an idea that only the strongest race in Germany should survive. And that was the Aryan race, Aryan. So any other ethnic minority group would only weaken the German Reich, in other words, the German Empire. So he encouraged, as we've learned before under our social policies for women to leave their jobs and to produce as many children as they could. It was seen as unacceptable to marry somebody who was not part of the Aryan race, and certainly not good to mix races, according to Hitler. So children were taught about this in school in something called eugenics, Eugenics. It's the idea of it being a bit like biology, but it was really about the survival of the fittest and this idea that only the most strongest members of society, aka the German Aryan race, should survive. Now, within Germany at the time, the Jews were kind of the largest minority group, if you know what I mean. So the vast majority of people in Germany were Aryan Germans, kind of from North European ethnic background. However, you've got a minority group that were Jewish. You've also got an ethnic group that came from kind of Eastern Europe and Russia, and that was a Slavic ethnicity, and they were persecuted. So the Slavs were persecuted under the Nazi regime. You've also got Romani gypsies as well, and they were persecuted. So 500,000 gypsies lost their lives under the Nazi regime. Okay, so it wasn't just ethnic minority groups that the Nazi regime persecuted. It was also groups within Germany. They could be North European ethnicity, they could be considered as Aryan, but for one reason or another, they were not part of this vision of a strong nation. Okay, so that could be to do with their beliefs, their lifestyle or practices, or if they were either mentally or physically disabled. So the groups that were mainly targeted were around 500,000 kind of tramps, beggars and alcoholics. So think about like your very poorest members of society, those that were not able to pick themselves up after the Great Depression and find work, maybe had turned to alcohol in a desperate measure or lost their homes and become a beggar. They were seen as undesirable, and 500,000 of them were sent to concentration camps from 1933 onwards. The other group were prostitutes, homosexuals and problem families. So any family that they're seen as behaving in a way that did not fit in with the Nazi ideals. So homosexuals, for example, it didn't fit with the kind of traditional produce lots of children ideology, which really relied upon heterosexual relationships. Along with that, don't forget that homophobia in the 1930s was incredibly high. So it was, there was a lot of homophobic hate within society anyway, and those groups were unfortunately persecuted as a result. The other group was anyone with a strong religious belief or political opponents. Now, I've talked about those already last week, gave some examples like Neumoller and Gallen as leaders of these religious groups. Pacifists as well, who refused to fight, were sent to concentration camps. The final group, you could say, were the physically and mentally disabled, and that accounted for 350,000 victims under the Nazi regime. And I think this is one of the most disturbing kind of policies that the Nazis introduced, and that was forced sterilisation. So if somebody had a inherited disease like Down syndrome, for example, in order to not spread that faulty gene onto another person, they would forcefully sterilise the people that were either mentally or physically handicapped. So it was a disgusting policy. It goes back to this idea of survival of the fittest. So it was taking kind of Darwinism to the extreme, and it resulted as well in a euthanasia program against people that were physically disabled. The rationale, if you could call it a rationale, that kind of underpinned this horrific policy was the idea that the strong in Germany were the most valued members of society, and if you had a disability, you could not work, and therefore you could not contribute to the Third Reich, and therefore you were undesirable. So it's a really kind of disgusting view that many religious leaders, for example, did not agree with, and tried to preach against it. But because it was a totalitarian state, a police state, you could say, anyone that spoke out in defence of the most weakest and vulnerable members of society were often sent to concentration camps. So I'm going to focus now on persecution of the Jews in particular, because the Jewish community were the worst affected by these policies. Now, if you remember my assembly last year when I talked about the different stages of persecution for the Jews, it really did happen gradually. So when you think about our perceptions of the Holocaust, we think about gas chambers and we think about piles of dead bodies. But actually, that was kind of the last sort of 3 or 4 years of the persecution. Before then was a whole decade of kind of their rights being perturbed and restricted, and their freedoms taken away gradually upon gradually, until the point when it wasn't seen as extreme anymore to be actually, taking them and putting them into ghettos, and then eventually shipping them over to the death camps where they would go to the gas chambers. So, for example, and it's worth reading up about these, I'm not going to go through all of the laws in this video, but one of the most important ones was in September 1935, and that was the Nuremberg laws. So this is 2 years after Hitler has come to power, and the Nuremberg laws strip the Jews of their citizenship, which means they're no longer citizens of Germany. And as a result of that, they are no longer given protection by the law courts, and they also it kind of opened the floodgates for kind of racial abuse to occur by ordinary citizens. And don't forget, those ordinary citizens had been fueled with hate propaganda against the Jews for a number of years by that point. The next really important event is in November 1938, and that was the Night of the Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht. Okay, and this is an event which apparently happened spontaneously in reaction to a German diplomat being killed by a Polish Jew in Paris, if you can get your head around that. So an assassination took place in Paris of a German diplomat by a Polish Jew. So somebody who had kind of worked or acted on their own accord, so to speak. And that had kind of fueled kind of anti-Semitic feeling. Anti-Semitism, by the way, is the phrase we use to say anti-Jewish or racial abuse of Jews. So this anti-Semitic feeling was fueled, and German citizens went about destroying synagogues, so the places of worship for the Jews, and shops and businesses in the Jewish quarters of cities. And it's known as the Night of the Broken Glass because the following morning all you see is shattered glass all across the streets. Now, it's said that this was done by ordinary German citizens. Now, that would have been true. Some German citizens would have got involved in that. Kind of the brainwashing of the German state would have worked on them, and they would have unleashed kind of a hatred towards the Jews. But it was also stoked by members of the Nazi Party, Nazi soldiers, who dressed in ordinary clothes and kind of provoked the crowds, so to speak. And the Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, used this as an opportunity to say, you know, clearly Germany are rejecting the Jews as a community, and it kind of acted as a justification for the horrific things that would follow in the 1940s. So persecution of the Jews, and indeed other minority groups, really accelerated during World War II. So from 1939 onwards, that persecution really did come to kind of that ultimate horrific point that we always think about. Now, a really important date to remember is January 1942. And this is when leading members of the Nazi Party, including members of the SS, met together in a place called Wannsee outside of Berlin, and they discussed what they called the Jewish problem. 1942, the war had just begun to turn against the Nazis. So Nazis kind of occupied at this point most of Central Europe, including many countries that had large Jewish populations, such as Poland. And they met because they genuinely believed that if they didn't do something about the Jewish populations within these countries, they would lose the war. So they met, they discussed, they came up with a final solution. And the final solution is, you know, the mass extermination of the Jews. Before that point, they'd been rounding the Jews up into ghettos in cities where there was a large Jewish population, such as Warsaw in Poland. But at this point, they were saying that ghettoization, so herding up the Jewish community and putting them all in one place, was not going to work efficiently enough, and they needed to mass exterminate them. So it was at that point when camps like Auschwitz were turned into death camps, and it was at that point when they created the gas chambers, and that's when you hear about the horrific story of, you know, up to 5,000 Jewish people losing their lives every single day in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, and then the burning of the bodies because they couldn't bury the bodies. There were just too many bodies for them to create mass graves and bury. So, you know, the real horrors of the Holocaust came about in those final few years. Okay, so that's kind of a very whistle-stop tour of persecution under the Nazis. You definitely need to do some reading about it. It's such an important topic, not just to history, but to understanding the modern world. So you can use Seneca, you can use KO, you can use Bite Size, you can just use, there's so many resources out there to find out about this, just to learn about it. My next video is going to focus on an interpretation question relating to this topic.